An innocent young woman was sold to an unknown millionaire. On their first night together, what he did made her heart race in a way she never imagined, and what happened next surprised everyone. Subscribe to the channel and drop a like to discover how this captivating story ends. The delicate lace veil slipped between her trembling fingers as Emily remained alone in that luxurious room, with the scent of jasmine invading her senses through the open windows that offered a privileged view of Fifth Avenue. The Venetian mirror in front of her reflected a young woman of 21, with eyes the color of honey and lips that had forgotten how to genuinely smile weeks ago. A person's worth isn't measured by the price others are willing to pay for them, but by what they're willing to sacrifice for those they love, thought Emily, repeating the words her father had whispered to her the night before. The contract was signed. The money transferred to her ill father's account, and now she awaited the moment she had feared since learning she would be handed over as collateral for a debt impossible to repay. The carved wooden door creaked softly as it opened, and Emily's heart stopped for an instant. Alexander Morgan entered with measured steps. His imposing figure, framed by an impeccable Italian linen suit, didn't project the threatening shadow she had imagined during so many sleepless nights. At 45, the silver at his temples and the expression lines around his dark eyes gave him a dignity that contrasted with her youth. To Emily's surprise, he didn't approach with the predatory urgency she expected from a man who had just purchased a wife. Instead, he placed a small silver key on the antique oak dresser. "This is the key to your room," he said in a deep but serene voice. "You decide when and if you want to open the door between our chambers." Their gazes met for the first time without the presence of notaries or lawyers. In Alexander's eyes there wasn't lust or domination, but something more complex that Emily couldn't decipher. "Why?" she dared to ask, her voice barely audible. "Why pay so much for a marriage that isn't real?" Alexander approached the window, contemplating the New York sunset that painted the century-old buildings with gold and crimson. "Sometimes, Emily, the coldest agreements hide the warmest stories," he responded enigmatically. "And sometimes what appears to be a transaction is merely the beginning of something that neither you nor I can imagine yet." When he withdrew, gently closing the door behind him, Emily was left staring at that small silver key that gleamed under the golden sunset light. It represented both a prison and a choice. And in that moment, she understood that the true captivity wasn't in the walls of that mansion, but in the limits she herself had imposed on her ability to see beyond appearances. The dawn in New York City lacked the intimacy of the small Virginia town where Emily had grown up. There the sun rose lazily over fields of oak and maple trees, while the aroma of freshly baked scones mingled with the bells of St. Peter's Church every morning. From the balcony of her new room in the Morgan mansion, she contemplated the hurried awakening of a city that never completely slept. The first weeks passed in a strange routine. Alexander would leave before dawn, always leaving a breakfast prepared with details that disconcerted her. Warm pastries like those from her hometown, orange blossom honey, and a fresh orchid beside the coffee cup. "The master is like that, always attentive to small details," commented Dorothy, the housekeeper, while arranging the damask curtains. "Since I've known him, he's never forgotten a birthday or a preference." "And why would a man like that need to buy a wife?" asked Emily, staring at the purple orchid next to her breakfast. The older woman, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised, gave her a look laden with meaning. "There are wounds, child, that not all the money in the world can heal, and there are loneliness that hurt more in palaces than in cottages." That afternoon, while timidly exploring the corridors of her new home, Emily discovered a half-open door that led to a private library. The aroma of leather and old paper enveloped her like a familiar embrace. Her father, Anthony, had always treasured the few books they could afford in his modest carpentry workshop. The room, lined with oak shelves to the ceiling, housed hundreds of meticulously organized volumes. But what caught her attention was a small portrait on the desk, a young man of humble appearance, in working clothes, smiling next to a middle-aged woman in front of a building under construction. "That was my first project," said Alexander's voice behind her, startling her. "I was 24 and could barely read blueprints, but I knew every brick and every beam like the lines of my own hand." Emily turned, embarrassed at being caught snooping. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "This house is now your home, Emily," he interrupted gently. "There are no closed doors for you except those you yourself decide not to open." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. The young woman observed the contrast between that young man in the photograph and the powerful man before her, wondering what events had carved those lines on his face, what joys and sorrows had shaped the empire he now possessed. "Is the woman in the photo your mother?" she finally asked. Alexander's expression darkened briefly, like a passing cloud on a sunny day. "Yes, Mercedes. I lost her many years ago when I was just beginning my path." After a pause, he added, "Your father reminds me of her in some ways. The same dignity, the same nobility in his gaze." The mention of her father made Emily feel a pang of guilt and nostalgia. "How is he?" "The doctor said that—" "I've sent the best specialists from Johns Hopkins Hospital," Alexander responded. "The new treatment shows promising results." Emily nodded, unable to articulate her gratitude. The first obstacle in her heart began to waver. This man, whom she had imagined as her captor, was saving her father's life beyond what was agreed in that cold marriage contract. "Why are you doing all this?" she whispered. Alexander approached the window, with the afternoon light drawing his silhouette against the glass. "Perhaps because many years ago, when I was just a boy with calloused hands and dreams too big, someone believed in me when no one else did. And I learned that second chances are the greatest gift we can offer." That night, as she observed the lights of New York City from her room, Emily felt for the first time that the distance between her and that stranger with whom she had joined her life began to shorten, not from obligation but from something more subtle and more powerful, the curiosity to discover what was hidden behind the mask of the powerful Alexander Morgan. The mansion kept secrets in every corner, like an old book whose chapters are only revealed to those who have the patience to turn its pages with reverence. During her third month under that handcrafted ceiling, Emily discovered a room that seemed to clash with the rest of the calculated opulence of the house. It was a simple space, almost austere, with walls covered in architectural plans and models of housing projects. These weren't the luxurious residential complexes that had made Alexander Morgan famous, but modest constructions with community courtyards, urban gardens, and spaces designed to foster coexistence. "Those are his secret projects," explained Dorothy, who had found her examining the documents with curiosity. "The master allocates almost a third of his earnings to build homes for homeless families and immigrants without resources in the outskirts of Chicago and New Orleans." Emily ran her fingers over the paper of a blueprint, feeling the textures beneath her skin. "Why keep it secret? Any other businessman would use it as publicity." The older woman smiled with wisdom, accumulated during decades of service. "Because Mr. Morgan believes that true charity is that which is done without expecting applause or recognition. As his mother used to say, the best seeds are planted in silence." That revelation planted a seed of doubt in Emily about everything she had imagined about her husband. The image of the ruthless magnate was fading like morning mist, revealing more complex, more human contours. Days later, while strolling through Central Park during a weekend, Emily stopped in front of a marble fountain where water sang crystalline melodies. Alexander observed her from a distance, respecting her space, as he always did. "Have you ever felt like that water?" she suddenly asked when he approached. "Trapped in a predetermined path, forced to flow through channels that others designed." Alexander contemplated the fountain, where stone nymphs eternally poured water from their vessels. "For a long time, yes," he admitted, with a sincerity that surprised her. "I built my fortune believing that success would liberate me, only to discover I had built a more elegant cage, but equally restrictive." "And now?" she inquired. "Now I try to redesign those channels, as I do with my architectural projects," he responded. "We can't change where the water comes from, but we can decide where it flows." A reflective silence settled between them as they observed the hypnotic play of water against the centuries-old stone. Emily felt something subtly changing within her, as if an invisible door was beginning to open. The first major test for their fragile understanding came in the form of an anonymous letter, delivered by a nervous messenger at the wrought iron gate of the mansion. Someone was threatening to expose their marriage as fraud if they didn't receive a considerable sum. Emily, with trembling hands, read the threats repeatedly in the solitude of her room. Should she hide it from Alexander? Face it herself? The letter implied knowledge of intimate details about the agreement with her father, about the illness, about money changing hands. Finally, Gathering courage, she sought her husband in his office. She found him bent over plans for a new project, with reading glasses that gave him a vulnerable air he rarely showed in public. "Alexander, I need to talk to you," she said, extending the letter with a trembling hand. He read the contents in silence, and to Emily's surprise he didn't show the anger or indignation she expected, but genuine concern for her. "What's important isn't this threat, Emily, but how you feel about it," he said finally. "Your well-being is the only thing that concerns me." That night, for the first time since her arrival, they dined together on the terrace overlooking the garden of jasmine and bougainvillea. Under a sky sprinkled with stars and enveloped in the intoxicating aroma of night flowers, Alexander told her his own story of vulnerability. "I was 17 when I lost my mother," he began, his voice tinged with an old sadness, still palpable. "Mercedes had taken out a loan so I could study, but when she fell ill and couldn't pay, creditors harassed her until she had to flee to Canada, where she died alone, far from me." Emily felt a knot in her throat, seeing the pain in the eyes of the man she had considered her captor. "I swore then that I would use every cent I earned to prevent other families from suffering the same fate," he continued. "That I would build a world where a person's worth wasn't measured by their ability to pay." The young woman understood then that the marriage contract, which she had perceived as a degrading transaction, was for him a way to honor that promise made to his mother's memory. "This threat is nothing," Alexander affirmed, gently covering Emily's hand with his. "I've faced much more dangerous financial shocks. What worries me is that you suffer because of this situation. I thought you had bought me," she confessed in a whisper, "that I was just another investment in your portfolio." Alexander's gaze softened, and for the first time, Emily glimpsed something new in his eyes, something warm and vulnerable. "No one can buy another person, Emily. We can only offer time, respect, and perhaps, if we're fortunate, mutual understanding." Under the starry mantle of that New York night, something began to transform between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but the first step of a long path toward trust, paved with shared truths and crumbling prejudices. The 1st of May dawned with an almost painful clarity over New York City. Emily observed from the balcony how the city prepared for the celebrations, with flags and flowers adorning the historic buildings. She had been in that mansion for almost 4 months, which, little by little, was beginning to feel less foreign. The phone rang with the urgency of bad news. It was Dorothy calling from the hospital where Anthony, Emily's father, had been admitted in emergency after a relapse. The young woman felt the ground vanishing beneath her feet. In a matter of minutes, Alexander had mobilized his driver, and they were on their way to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where Anthony had been transferred by express order of the businessman to receive specialized care. During the journey, she observed Alexander's tense profile, his hands gripping the phone tightly while coordinating the arrival of specialists. He seemed genuinely concerned, as if Anthony's health were as important to him as it was to her. "He'll recover," said Emily, trying to convince herself more than her companion. Alexander took her hand gently, in a gesture so natural that neither of them seemed to notice. "Your father is a strong man, Emily. He has survived much harder times." The way he said it with such certainty and knowledge aroused Emily's curiosity. "You speak as if you know him well," she commented. Something passed through Alexander's eyes, a fleeting shadow of doubt that Emily had never seen in him before. "There are things we should talk about, but now is not the time," he responded enigmatically. At the hospital, while Anthony slept connected to machines monitoring his vital signs, Emily observed with amazement how Alexander held her father's trembling hand and promised him in perfect English that everything would be fine. There was a familiarity in that gesture that transcended simple charity or the fulfillment of an agreement. That night, when Anthony was finally stable, Emily found Alexander in the hospital cafeteria, contemplating a cup of cold coffee with a distant expression. "There's something you haven't told me," she said, sitting across from him. The man looked up, and Emily saw in his eyes the weight of long-kept secrets. "I met your father many years ago," Alexander began with a grave voice. "I was a young construction worker of 24, working on a site on Wall Street. He was a specialized carpenter of 30, who taught me not only the trade, but the importance of maintaining dignity even in the hardest jobs." Emily listened, incredulous, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. "Anthony lent me money from his scarce savings so I could buy my first lot," Alexander continued. He told me he saw potential in me, that someday I would build important things. My father knew you? All this time? Emily's voice trembled between surprise and indignation. The marriage was his idea? Alexander nodded slowly. When he learned of his illness, he contacted me after almost 20 years. He didn't want charity, Emily. He wanted to ensure someone would take care of you when he was no longer here. And he thought of that young man he once helped. And you accepted out of pity? For an old debt? The words came out more bitter than she intended. I accepted because I deeply respect your father, Alexander responded calmly. And because... He stopped, as if the following words weighed too much to be pronounced. Because what? She insisted. Because the moment I saw you for the first time, with your simple cotton dress and those defiant honey-colored eyes, I felt something I believed was lost forever. The confession hung between them like a fragile promise. Emily didn't know what to answer. What she had considered a sale turned out to be, in reality, the last act of love from a father who knew better than herself what she would need in the future. Our marriage remains your choice, Emily, Alexander added, breaking the silence. The contract, the money, all that is secondary. Any moment you wish for your freedom, just ask. In the hospital corridor, under the fluorescent light that gave everyone a ghostly appearance, Emily felt something fundamental changing within her. It wasn't gratitude, not even affection, but the awakening of a possibility she had never considered, that this man, whom she had feared and then tolerated, could be someone she might eventually choose. As they returned to the mansion in the early morning, with New York sleeping around them, Emily reflected on the revealed truths and those that still remained hidden. Her life, which she believed reduced to a simple commercial transaction, was beginning to reveal layers of meaning she could never have imagined. Sometimes, she murmured, almost to herself, the most important stories begin as the most painful lies. Alexander looked at her briefly, with a mixture of surprise and admiration for the depth of her observation. And sometimes, he responded, destiny writes with invisible ink paths that we can only read when we've traveled half the journey. May slipped into June with the softness of a summer sigh. Central Park exploded with colors, while New York prepared for the hot nights that would transform the city into a hub of nightlife. In the Morgan mansion, however, there was an air of contained transition. Anthony had been transferred at Alexander's insistence to a medical suite set up in the east wing of the house. Each morning, Emily awoke with the certainty that her father was just a few steps away, and each night before retiring, Alexander would personally check that he had everything he needed. In those fleeting moments, when Alexander conversed with Anthony in a low voice, Emily glimpsed a different version of the businessman, more relaxed, more authentic, as if only in her father's presence could he shed the armor he wore before the world. One afternoon, while working on embroidering a tablecloth, a skill inherited from her mother that she practiced to calm her anxiety, Emily found a forgotten notebook in the leather-lined library. Among its yellowed pages, she discovered poems written by Alexander, verses that evoked Robert Frost and Walt Whitman, imbued with a sensitivity that contrasted with the public image of the ruthless businessman. One in particular, dated 2 decades earlier, spoke of eyes that carry silent storms like the fields of Virginia. Emily felt a shiver upon recognizing the description of her own eyes, as if he had been waiting for her for years, long before knowing her. That night, during dinner, a ritual they had begun to share with increasing frequency, Emily gathered the courage to address what she had discovered. I didn't know you wrote poetry, she commented with feigned casualness. Alexander left his glass of red wine halfway to his lips, surprised. It's been many years since I've written, he responded after a pause. It was a way of processing emotions I didn't allow myself to show in the business world. Love is a blind architect that builds invisible bridges between distant souls. She quoted one of the verses from memory. It's beautiful. An almost imperceptible blush tinged Alexander's cheeks, something Emily had never seen in him. Those were different times, he explained, uncomfortable, when I still believed that life could be like in poems. And you don't believe that anymore? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither dared to name. I believe that true poetry isn't in written words, but in everyday actions, he finally responded. In the way your father carves wood with devotion, or how you tend to the garden flowers each morning, thinking no one observes you. The implicit confession that he watched her in her private moments, far from disturbing her, evoked in Emily a warm sensation she couldn't identify. The decisive moment came days later, when they received an invitation to a benefit gala at the Metropolitan Opera House. It would be their first public appearance as a couple before New York high society. "We don't have to attend if you don't feel comfortable," Alexander offered, aware of her anxiety. Emily contemplated the invitation, running her fingers over the linen paper with embossed letters. It was more than a social event. It represented a decision: to continue maintaining the appearances of a marriage of convenience, or to begin building something real, based on the mutual respect and understanding that had blossomed between them. "I'll go," she finally declared, "but I'll need an appropriate dress." Alexander's smile illuminated his face in a way Emily had never seen. "I know exactly the perfect place." The next day, he took her to a small atelier in the Upper East Side, directed by a Virginia designer who created exclusive pieces inspired by American traditions. There, among silks and laces, Emily chose a burgundy dress that evoked the Virginia lands of her childhood. The night of the gala, as she prepared, Emily felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. She looked at herself in the mirror, hardly recognizing the confident young woman who looked back at her. 5 months ago, she had entered that mansion as merchandise. That night, she would leave as a woman by her own choice. As she descended the marble staircase, she saw Alexander's expression subtly change. It wasn't desire that shone in his eyes, but a deep, almost reverential admiration. "You are," he began for the first time without words. "Ready to be your wife tonight," she completed with a shy but determined smile. On the way to the opera house, Emily made the decision that would change the course of her story. "I've been thinking, Alexander," she said with a firm but gentle voice. "I want our marriage to be real." He looked at her with astonishment, as if fearing he had misheard. "Emily, you have no obligation to—" "I'm not talking about obligations," she interrupted. "I'm talking about choices. For months I believed I had lost my ability to choose, but now I see that each day, each moment has been a choice. And today I choose to give us a true opportunity." When they arrived at the gala, they crossed the doors together, not as actors playing a role, but as two people who were beginning to write their own story, beyond the contract that had initially united them. What neither could foresee was that night, amid champagne and diplomatic conversations, they would face the first real test of their nascent union. The Metropolitan Opera House shone under thousands of lights that transformed its facade into an almost dreamlike vision. New York's aristocracy and the American business elite mingled in a dance of appearances, power, and wealth, barely disguised under the banner of charity. Emily felt the gazes upon her as she advanced on Alexander's arm through the main hall, whispers that died down as they passed, calculated smiles that didn't reach the eyes of those who offered them. It was a world foreign to hers, an ecosystem with unwritten rules that everyone seemed to know except her. "Breathe," Alexander murmured near her ear. "Half of these people built their fortune by selling properties during the crisis, and the other half inherited surnames that no longer mean anything. You have more nobility in your heart than all of them combined." His words gave her the strength she needed to raise her chin and enter that social game with dignity. The introductions were an endless parade of names and titles that Emily tried to memorize. Most treated her with polite indifference, some with barely disguised curiosity, evaluating what the powerful Alexander Morgan might have seen in that simple young woman from Virginia. During dinner, she was seated next to Elizabeth Dawson, wife of a prominent banker, a woman of 50 whose smile didn't reach the calculating coldness of her eyes. "So, Virginia," commented Elizabeth, pronouncing the name of the state as if it were an exotic disease. "How did you and Alexander meet? He's always been so selective with his relationships." Emily felt the trap in the apparently innocent question. Around her, several conversations had subtly silenced to hear her response. "We met through my father," she responded with simplicity, remembering Alexander's advice to stay close to the truth. "He and Alexander shared work many years ago." "How too quaint," Elizabeth responded with a forced smile. "It's always refreshing to see how some provincial girls rise in life through such creative methods, and with older men who could be their fathers." The silence that followed was as dense as fog. Emily felt the heat rising to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Alexander's voice resonated with a clarity that froze the surrounding conversations. My wife Elizabeth, he said, approaching the table with a champagne flute, possesses something that not all the money in New York could buy: integrity and courage. Increasingly rare qualities in our circles, don't you think? His tone was cordial, but his eyes contained a clear warning. Elizabeth paled slightly, aware she had crossed an invisible line. I was only joking, Alexander. Your young wife is absolutely charming. And extremely intelligent, he added, placing a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. So much so that she's advising me on my new sustainable housing project. Her perspective on integrated communities has been revealing. Emily looked at him, surprised. They hadn't discussed any project together, but she understood he was offering much more than a simple social defense. He was giving her a place of her own in his world. Later, during the dance, as they moved to the rhythm of a waltz performed by the orchestra, Emily rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, feeling inexplicably safe in his arms. "Thank you," she whispered, "for defending me there." He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I wasn't defending you, Emily. I was telling the truth. Since you came into my life, you've brought a clarity I didn't know I needed." Under the centuries-old chandeliers, Emily understood that what had begun as an agreement was transforming into something much deeper, and what astonished her most wasn't this change, but how natural it felt. The true trial by fire, however, came 2 days later, when economic newspapers published a sensationalist article insinuating that Alexander Morgan's marriage was a strategy to divert attention from financial problems in his construction company. Emily found Alexander in his office, surrounded by newspapers and with the phone ringing incessantly. "This isn't about you," he said as soon as he saw her. "It's Richard Miller, my former partner. He's been trying to discredit me for years because I refused to participate in his speculation schemes in the Hamptons." Richard Miller. The name sent a chill through Emily. The same one who was my father's creditor. Alexander looked at her with surprise, and then a shadow of understanding crossed his face. "Richard was the one threatening your family?" His voice had acquired a dangerous edge. "This changes everything, Emily." "What do you mean?" "It means our marriage wasn't a coincidence," Alexander explained, rising to pace nervously around the room. "Richard must have discovered my connection to your father and used his debt to get to me. He turned you into a piece of his revenge." The revelation hit Emily like an icy wave. All that time she had believed she was the protagonist of her own story, when in reality she had been manipulated in a power game between powerful men. So all of this was part of a business conspiracy? Alexander stopped in front of her, taking her hands in his with an urgency he had never shown. "The origin, perhaps, but not what happened afterward, Emily. What's between us now is real, at least for me." She withdrew her hands, needing space to process the truth. "I need time," she said finally, "to understand what part of my life I've truly lived and which has been written by others." "All that you need," he responded, respecting her distance. "But I want you to know that, whatever the reason you came into my life, choosing to stay by your side each day is the most authentic decision I've made in decades." That night, Emily didn't sleep. She contemplated the silver key Alexander had given her on the first day, a symbol of a choice that she now understood had been more complex than she imagined. Reality had transformed into a kaleidoscope, where each turn revealed new patterns, new truths, new challenges. At dawn, she made a decision. If her life had been manipulated by others until then, from that moment on she would take control of her own narrative. And the first step would be to confront Richard Miller, not as a victim but as an equal. What she didn't know was that this decision would lead her down a path of even deeper discoveries about Alexander's past, about her father, and about herself. Chicago welcomed Emily with the metropolitan light that transformed modern buildings into almost liquid visions under the July sun. Behind her, the main headquarters of Morgan Construction rose like a monument to ambition and power, while in front of her, just a few blocks away, stood the building of the Lakeside Group, Richard Miller's empire. "You don't have to do this alone," Alexander insisted over the phone. "I can be there in 3 hours." "That's precisely why I must do it alone," Emily responded, with a determination that surprised even herself. "My entire life I've been defined by others. It's time for me to write my own story." After hanging up, she adjusted the navy blue suit she had carefully chosen for the occasion. It wasn't the attire of the frightened young woman who had arrived at the Morgan mansion 6 months ago, but that of a woman who had learned to navigate turbulent waters. Richard Miller's office occupied the top floor of the building with panoramic views of Lake Michigan. A stocky man, around 55, with the type of permanent tan that speaks of yachts in the Hamptons and vacations in Saint-Tropez, received her with a predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The young Mrs. Morgan," he said, extending a hand that Emily deliberately ignored. "What an unexpected surprise." "Spare me the courtesies, Mr. Miller," she responded coldly. "I'm here to talk about my father, Anthony Wright, and the debt you used to manipulate our lives." Richard let out a laugh that resonated like broken glass. "Straight to the point, like your husband. Alexander has trained you well." "No one has trained me," Emily replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "I've learned on my own to recognize people who use others' suffering as chips in their power game." The man poured himself a whiskey without offering her anything, a small gesture of contempt that Emily noticed but decided to ignore. "Your father took a loan he couldn't repay, girl. That's how the world works. The strong survive, the weak take loans." "My father didn't owe you anything," Emily affirmed, pulling documents from her portfolio. "I've reviewed every paper, every receipt. The supposed debt was artificially created, with abusive interest and hidden clauses, all to get to Alexander through me." Richard looked at her with a new expression, a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. "You're smarter than you look," he conceded. "But that changes nothing. Your marriage is still a fraud, and I have evidence that would ruin the great Alexander Morgan's reputation if made public." "And what would you gain from that, besides petty satisfaction?" Emily asked. "Is it worth destroying the future of hundreds of families who depend on his projects just for personal revenge?" Something in her words seemed to touch a sensitive point in Richard. "Do you know why I hate your husband?" he asked, with a suddenly grave voice. "Because 20 years ago, when we were partners, I discovered he was diverting funds from the company." "That's impossible," Emily immediately replied. "Is it? Ask him about the Hampton South project of 2005. Ask him where $5 million that disappeared from the accounts really went." Emily maintained her composure, though inside she felt the ground moving beneath her feet. "And instead of reporting him, you decided to wait 2 decades to orchestrate an elaborate revenge using me as a pawn." Richard smiled, this time with something resembling sadness. "Justice is slow, Mrs. Morgan, and sometimes we must create it ourselves." When Emily left the building, Chicago's light seemed to have lost its brightness. Richard's words had planted a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore. What if Alexander wasn't the honorable man she had come to admire? That same afternoon, instead of returning to New York, she took a flight to New Orleans, where one of Alexander's oldest projects was located, a residential complex for low-income families that had been pioneering in social integration. Hope District was very different from what she expected. Instead of the typical social housing project, she found clean streets with vibrantly colored buildings, community gardens, and a cultural center where children of diverse backgrounds played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. "You must be Emily," said an older woman with gray hair and sun-weathered skin. "I'm Mrs. Louise, president of the Neighborhood Association. Mr. Alexander told us you might come." Emily was surprised. She hadn't told anyone her plans after Chicago. "Do you know Alexander Morgan well?" she asked as they walked through the neighborhood. "Know him?" Mrs. Louise let out a warm laugh. "That man lived among us for 6 months when he was building this neighborhood. He ate the same as us, slept in a simple room, and worked harder than any of the laborers." Emily listened attentively, looking for some indication that would confirm or deny Richard's accusations. "This neighborhood was built with money that officially disappeared from a luxury project in the Hamptons," continued Mrs. Louise. "Mr. Alexander risked everything to divert those funds and give us a home when no one else would bet on us." "He diverted funds?" Emily felt her heart accelerate. "Legally, no," the woman clarified. "The money was his, from his share of the profits. But his partner, a certain Richard, wanted to invest it all in more luxury apartments. Mr. Alexander preferred to use it for something with real meaning, and that's something Richard never forgave." As the sun set over New Orleans, Emily understood the magnitude of what she had discovered. What Richard called misappropriation of funds was, in reality, an act of social justice that Alexander had carried out by sacrificing potential personal benefits. On the flight back to New York, Contemplating the landscape that was fading in the twilight, Emily made a decision. She would confront Alexander, not from doubt, but from the genuine search for the complete truth. What she didn't expect was to find, upon arriving at the mansion past midnight, an official letter from the New York Supreme Court. Richard Miller had filed a formal complaint against Alexander, accusing him of tax fraud, contract manipulation, and, most seriously, fraudulent marriage for tax evasion purposes. The war that had been latent for 2 decades had finally erupted, and she found herself at the center of the battlefield. New York was burning under the August heat, a scorching warmth that seemed to reflect the intensity of the conflict, now dominating the headlines of all economic newspapers. Morgan Empire under investigation. Construction magnate's marriage fraud. In the mansion, now converted into a fortress besieged by journalists and photographers camping nearby, hoping for valuable captures, Emily observed Alexander working tirelessly with his legal team. The deep circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw revealed the weight he was bearing. "You should rest," she suggested one night, entering his office with a cup of tea. Alexander looked up from the documents, and for an instant, Emily glimpsed the exhaustion he was striving to hide. "I can't afford that luxury," he responded. "Richard hasn't just attacked me, but everyone who depends on my projects. If the company falls, hundreds of families will lose their jobs, their homes." Emily sat across from him, remembering her visit to New Orleans and the revelations she had found. "Why did you never tell me about Hope District?" she asked directly. "About how you diverted the money from the Hamptons to build it." Alexander visibly tensed. "How?" "I went to New Orleans," she confessed, "after seeing Richard in Chicago." A dense silence settled between them. Finally, Alexander rose and approached the window, contemplating the garden immersed in darkness. "It was my money," he explained, "my share of the profits. But Richard wanted to reinvest all of it in more luxury properties, maximizing benefits without regard for social cost. I refused." "Mrs. Louise told me everything," Emily said softly. "How you lived there, how you worked alongside them. You weren't the type of man I imagined when I first entered this house." Alexander turned to her. With a vulnerability in his gaze he rarely allowed to be seen. "I've made many mistakes, Emily. I've been hard, sometimes ruthless in business, but I've always tried to compensate for the harm this world can cause. Why keep it secret? If people knew what you really do with your fortune—" "Because true charity doesn't seek recognition," he responded, repeating the words Emily had heard from Dorothy months ago. "And because in this world, kindness is often confused with weakness. I couldn't protect those who depend on me if I showed all my cards." In that moment, Emily understood the complexity of the man she had married. He wasn't the saint who built neighborhoods for the disadvantaged, nor the ruthless magnate the press described. He was a man trying to navigate an imperfect system, trying to do good without being destroyed in the process. The real fall came 3 days later. Investors began withdrawing their support, fearful of bad publicity. Banks froze credit lines. Several construction projects were paralyzed. The company Alexander had built over 25 years was beginning to crumble like a house of cards. On a particularly difficult night, after receiving news that they would have to lay off 50 employees, Emily found Alexander on the terrace, contemplating the city that stretched before them like a sea of blinking lights. "Everything I've worked for," he murmured, his voice broken by contained emotion. "Everything I built since I was a simple laborer on that construction site is disappearing." Emily approached, and for the first time since they had known each other, it was she who took his hand in a gesture of consolation. "Nothing really disappears," she said gently. "What you've built isn't just buildings, but transformed lives. No one can take that away from you." Alexander looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. "How can you have such clarity in the midst of this storm? You, who were dragged into this disaster without deserving it." "Because I've learned more from you than you imagine," she responded, "to see beyond the evident, to seek the truth behind appearances." In an impulse born of desperation and admiration, Alexander brought his face to hers. Their lips met for the first time in a kiss that tasted of vulnerability and newly discovered strength. When they separated, something had irrevocably changed between them. They were no longer the magnate and the provincial young woman bound to him by a contract, but two people who had chosen to be together despite circumstances, or perhaps precisely because of them. The true blow, however, came the following morning. Anthony, Emily's father, suffered a severe relapse. The stress of seeing his daughter and Alexander in the newspapers, subjected to public scrutiny, had affected his delicate health. In the hospital room, under the monotonous hum of the machines, Anthony took Emily's hand with surprising strength for such a weakened man. "Forgive me, my daughter," he whispered. "All of this is my fault." "Don't say that, Dad," she responded with contained tears. "You only wanted to protect me." "There's something I must tell you," Anthony continued with difficulty. "Something about your mother, about your true origin." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at Alexander, who remained at the door, respecting the intimacy of the moment but offering his presence as silent support. "Isabella wasn't your biological mother," Anthony revealed. "We took you in when you were just a newborn. Your real mother had to leave you in our care due to circumstances she couldn't control." "What are you saying?" Emily's voice was barely audible. "Your biological mother was Mercedes, Isabella's younger sister," Anthony continued. "She had to flee to Canada, pursued by debts and by a dangerous man. She asked us to care for you until she could return, but she never did." Emily looked at Alexander, whose face had visibly paled. "Mercedes," he murmured. "Was she Isabella's sister?" Anthony nodded weakly. They were inseparable in their youth in Williamsburg, until one family moved to Chicago during the difficult years. The pieces fit together with painful precision. Mercedes, Alexander's mother, and Isabella, the woman Emily had known as her mother, had been childhood friends. Destiny, in its intricate dance, had united their children through a tortuous path of coincidences and decisions. "I always wanted to tell you," Anthony continued, his voice growing weaker, "but I was afraid of losing you. You are my daughter in all that matters, Emily. In all that will ever matter." That night, while Anthony slept under the doctor's vigilance, Emily and Alexander sat in the hospital cafeteria, trying to process the magnitude of what they had discovered. "We're second cousins," said Emily, still dazed. "Our mothers were first cousins." Alexander passed a hand over his face, visibly moved. "My mother always spoke of an Isabella, of an interrupted friendship," he recalled. "I never imagined that it could be your mother." In the midst of the most serious professional crisis of his life, facing the possible ruin of everything he had built, Alexander found an unexpected connection with Emily, a bond that transcended the marriage contract and sank into the very roots of their family histories. "It's as if our paths were destined to cross," Emily reflected. Despite the age difference, despite everything. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something crystallized between them, the certainty that, whatever the outcome of the legal battle against Richard, they would face what came next together. No longer from obligation, but by choice. What neither could foresee was that destiny still held one more card, a final revelation that would forever change their understanding of the shared past they were just beginning to discover. September arrived with torrential rains that washed the streets of New York, as if the city itself needed purification. In the Morgan mansion, now converted into a kind of crisis headquarters, Emily had assumed a role she never would have imagined, organizing financial documents, coordinating with the legal team, and maintaining a surprising calm while the world Alexander had built dangerously teetered. "Shall you have a natural gift for this?" he commented one night, observing her as she methodically classified evidence for the trial. "In 6 months you've learned what takes others years." Emily looked up from the papers with a tired but genuine smile. "Perhaps because I was never afraid to learn. In my town, women did everything, from managing family accounts to repairing roofs." Alexander contemplated her with admiration. The shy young woman who had crossed the threshold of his house months ago had transformed into a confident and capable woman, whose strength came not from hardness, but from a resilience cultivated through years of challenges. That night, while an electrical storm illuminated the Hudson Valley in the distance, both were in the library, reviewing old files in search of any document that might help in their defense. "Look at this," said Emily, holding a yellowed envelope. "They're letters, from my mother Isabella to yours." Alexander approached, surprised by the discovery. Between her fingers, fragments of the past came to life. "Dear Mercedes, times are difficult in Williamsburg, but your memory illuminates our grey days." Anthony has secured work in a carpentry shop in New York City. We will depart soon. If only our paths would cross again someday. Remember that midsummer night, when we dreamed by the fire that our children would meet? Perhaps destiny is wiser than we are. The delicate handwriting, yellowed by the passage of time, revealed a bond that transcended generations. Mercedes and Isabella, separated by geography but united by an unbreakable affection, had dreamed of reuniting their families long before Emily and Alexander were even born. "It's as if they had planted a seed," Emily murmured. "And we are the tree that has finally grown." A particularly close thunder shook the windows, momentarily plunging the room into darkness when the electricity failed. In that intimate penumbra, illuminated only by sporadic lightning, Alexander finally shared the confession he had kept for months. "I fell in love with you the moment I first saw you," he admitted in a deep voice. "With your simple cotton dress and those defiant honey-colored eyes that seemed to see through my defenses." Emily held her breath, surprised by the sudden vulnerability. "But I feared that any advance would be interpreted as an abuse of power," he continued. "A 45-year-old man imposing his desires on a 21-year-old woman in a vulnerable position. I couldn't allow myself to become the type of person I've always despised." "That's why the key," Emily understood. "That's why the respect, the distance." Alexander nodded, his face briefly illuminated by lightning. "I preferred to live in solitude than to obtain your company through coercion or obligation. I wanted it to be your choice, always." In the intimacy of that shared darkness, Emily shortened the distance between them. For the first time, it was she who initiated contact, gently placing her lips on Alexander's. "It is my choice," she whispered against his mouth. "It has been for a long time, although I myself didn't dare to recognize it." The light returned, discovering them in an embrace that seemed to contain decades of yearning. Not just their own, but also that of Isabella and Mercedes, separated friends whose midsummer night dream was finally materializing through their children. That night, when Emily finally used the key she had kept for 7 months, she didn't do it from contractual obligation or conjugal duty, but because she had found in Alexander not the powerful man society knew, but the complex, imperfect, and deeply integral human being who was hidden behind the facade of the real estate magnate. In the intimacy of their shared chambers, they discovered that the age difference that had concerned them so much vanished before the harmony of their souls. Between caresses and whispered confessions, they reconstructed their story, this time without contracts or obligations, only with the naked truth of two people who had found in each other an unexpected refuge amid the storm. "All my life I've built buildings," Alexander confessed, stroking Emily's hair as the morning light began to filter through the curtains. "But I never understood what it truly meant to create a home until you arrived." Emily, reclining on his chest, listening to the constant beating of his heart, understood that sometimes the greatest truths are revealed in moments of greatest vulnerability, when all defenses fall and only the essence of who we truly are remains. "Sometimes," she murmured, recalling the words Alexander had pronounced on the day of her arrival, "the coldest agreements hide the warmest stories." He smiled, recognizing his own words returned as a gift. "And sometimes," he completed, "what appears to be a transaction is merely the beginning of something that neither you nor I could imagine." What neither knew was that this night of confessions and union represented not just a turning point in their relationship, but also the calm before the final storm that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The courtroom of the New York Supreme Court had become a theater where the most commented drama in the city was being played out. In the front rows, economic and society journalists took notes frenetically. Behind, competitors and former allies of Alexander observed with a mixture of pity and barely disguised satisfaction the possible collapse of one of the most important real estate empires in America. Emily, seated next to Alexander at the defense table, maintained her composure with a dignity that imposed respect even among the most critical. Her sober, pearl-gray suit contrasted with the youth of her face, but the determination in her gaze evidenced a maturity forged in the crucible of recent months. Richard Miller, from the prosecution table, shot them triumphant looks. The evidence he had presented seemed conclusive. Documents about the marriage signed for convenience, transfers to Anthony's account, testimonies from discontented employees. During a recess, in the privacy of a small room reserved for the defense, Alexander's lawyer spoke to them with brutal frankness. "Things don't look good," he admitted, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Richard has built a solid case. If we continue on this path, we will not only lose the trial, but you could face criminal charges, Alexander." Emily observed how her husband assimilated the news with the calm of someone who has already considered all possible scenarios. "What are our options?" she asked, refusing to accept defeat. The lawyer, a 60-year-old man with decades of experience in the courts, sighed deeply. "There is a way out," he said finally. "If you admit that the marriage was effectively an agreement of convenience but without intention of tax fraud, we could negotiate a substantial fine but avoid criminal charges." "That would mean publicly admitting that our marriage is a sham," Emily responded, feeling the ground vanishing beneath her feet. "It's the least damaging option," the lawyer insisted. "You could later annul the marriage, and although the reputation would suffer, the company could be saved." When they were alone, a heavy silence settled between them. Through the window, New York continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding within those walls. "I won't allow you to sacrifice everything you've built to protect me," Emily finally said, breaking the silence. "We can admit it was an initial agreement and then separate legally." Alexander looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, with a vulnerability he rarely allowed to be seen. "To separate?" Emily swallowed hard, fighting against the knot forming in her throat. "I want you not to lose everything you've worked for over 25 years. I want the projects that benefit hundreds of families to continue. I didn't ask what you want for me," he gently interrupted. "I asked what you want for yourself, for us." The question hung between them like a fragile promise. In that moment, Emily understood they were at a fundamental crossroads. They could take the safe path, which would protect Alexander's empire, or they could risk everything to defend what had become something authentic and valuable beyond any contract. Before she could respond, the door opened. It was Dorothy, her face contorted with worry. "Mr. Anthony has worsened," she announced with a trembling voice. "The doctors say you should go immediately." The trial, the accusations, the possible ruin, everything vanished before the urgency of that news. At the hospital, they found Anthony connected to more machines than ever, his labored breathing marking an irregular rhythm that froze the blood. "Dad," Emily whispered, taking his hand in hers. The man slowly opened his eyes, a weak smile momentarily illuminating his emaciated face. "My little one," he murmured with difficulty. "My brave Emily." "Don't talk. You need to rest," she insisted, containing her tears. Anthony weakly shook his head. "Listen to me, daughter. There's something else you need to know." Emily looked at Alexander, who remained respectfully at a certain distance, but close enough to offer his silent support. "Richard Miller," Anthony continued with a broken voice. "He was the man your biological mother was fleeing from." The revelation fell upon them like an avalanche. Alexander approached, unable to remain at the margins. "Richard knew Mercedes?" he asked, with a palpable tension in each syllable. Anthony nodded weakly. "He harassed her for years. When she rejected him for the last time, he swore to avenge himself on all she loved. That's why Mercedes had to flee, leaving Emily in our care." The pieces of the puzzle fit together with painful precision. Richard's persecution of Alexander, the manipulation of Anthony's debt, even the forced marriage. Everything formed part of an elaborate revenge spanning decades against the woman who had dared to reject him. "You must use this information," Anthony insisted, squeezing Emily's hand with surprising strength for such a weakened man. "It's the only proof that demonstrates Richard's true motivation. This isn't about business, but a twisted personal vendetta." That night, while Anthony finally rested under the doctor's vigilance, Emily and Alexander faced the most important decision of their lives. In a cafeteria near the hospital with cups of cold coffee before them, they weighed their options. "If we reveal Richard's connection to Mercedes, we'll expose the entire family history," said Emily. "My true origin, our connection through our mothers, everything. And we'll also demonstrate that Richard has manipulated justice for a personal vendetta," Alexander added, "but the price would be exposing your private life to public scrutiny." Emily remained silent, contemplating the distorted reflection of the lights on the surface of her coffee. Finally, she looked up, with a renewed determination shining in her eyes. "All my life I've been trapped in secrets others decided to keep for me," she said firmly. "It's time for me to decide which truths should come to light." Alexander extended his hand across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture of absolute support. "Whatever your decision, I'll respect it and stand by your side," he promised. "Even if that means losing everything." In that moment, under the dim light of that anonymous cafeteria, Emily made the decision that would change the course of their lives. They would defend their marriage, not as an agreement of convenience, but as what it had truly become, a union forged in mutual respect, admiration, and a love that had flourished against all odds. And to do so, she would have to expose to the world the complete truth about her origin, about Mercedes and Isabella, about Richard Miller's unhealthy obsession that had manipulated their destinies for decades. What neither knew was that this decision would trigger consequences that would transform not only their lives, but also those of everyone involved in that complex web of secrets and half-truths. The return to the courtroom after 3 days of recess due to Anthony's health marked a turning point in the case. A murmur ran through the room when Emily, instead of sitting next to Alexander at the defense table, approached the stand to testify as a witness. Richard Miller observed her with a condescending smile, sure of his victory. After all, what could that provincial young woman contribute that wasn't just confirmation of her marriage of interest? Emily, dressed with an elegant simplicity that contrasted with the ostentatious jewelry of the socialites present, took the oath with a clear and firm voice. The silence in the room was so dense it could be palpable. "Mrs. Morgan," began the defense attorney, "could you explain to the court the nature of your relationship with Alexander Morgan?" Emily looked directly into Richard's eyes before responding, a gaze loaded with a strength that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "My relationship with Alexander began as an agreement," she admitted with disarming honesty. "An arranged marriage to save my family from a debt artificially fabricated by Richard Miller as part of a personal vendetta that goes back more than 25 years. The murmur in the room grew. The judge struck with his gavel, demanding order. "A personal vendetta?" inquired the attorney, following the agreed strategy. "Could you elaborate?" Emily took a deep breath. It was time to expose long-hidden truths. "Richard Miller met my biological mother, Mercedes, in Chicago almost 30 years ago," she began, her voice firm despite the contained emotion. "When she rejected his advances, he swore to destroy all those she loved. My biological mother had to flee to Canada, leaving me in the care of her cousin Isabella and Anthony, whom I always considered my parents." The room had fallen completely silent. Even the journalists had stopped writing, absorbed in the narrative. "Mercedes was Alexander's mother," Emily continued. "Our mothers, first cousins and inseparable friends in their youth, were separated by life's circumstances. Destiny, in its intricate dance, united their children through this supposed marriage arrangement, orchestrated by the same man who provoked the initial separation." Richard Miller had turned pale. His lawyers exchanged nervous looks, aware that the case was taking an unexpected turn. "I have here," Emily proceeded, while the defense attorney presented an envelope, "the letters my mother Isabella wrote to Mercedes over the years, dreaming that someday their children would meet. And I also have documents that prove how Richard Miller falsified my father's debt, manipulated financial situations, and used his influence to destroy Alexander's reputation, all as part of an obsessive revenge against a woman who had the audacity to reject him decades ago." For the next 2 hours, Emily testified with an eloquence and clarity that impressed even the judge. She didn't hide that the marriage had begun as an agreement, but described with touching honesty the transformation it had undergone, how what began as a transaction had become a genuine union based on respect, admiration, and finally, love. "Our marriage is not a fraud," she concluded, looking directly at Alexander, whose eyes shone with contained emotion. "It's a story of redemption, of second chances, and of how destiny sometimes writes with invisible ink paths that we can only read when we've traveled half the journey." When she finished her testimony, a reverent silence filled the room. Richard Miller, decompensated, abandoned the courtroom before the session concluded, aware that his meticulously planned revenge had crumbled before the naked truth. 3 days later, the judge dismissed all charges against Alexander, recognizing Richard Miller's manipulation and systematic harassment. Additionally, he ordered an investigation into the prosecutor's business practices, who now faced serious legal problems for document falsification and harassment. The victory in court, however, came with a price. Emily and Alexander's family history, their connection through Mercedes and Isabella, and the humble origins of the real estate magnate had become front-page material in all national newspapers. That night, as they discreetly celebrated on the mansion's terrace under a starry sky that seemed to bless their triumph, Emily found Alexander contemplating the city with a reflective expression. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, approaching to rest her head on his shoulder. "How sometimes we lose something to gain something much more valuable," he responded, encircling her waist with an arm. "My perfect public image has crumbled, but in exchange, for the first time in decades, I feel authentically free." Emily smiled, perfectly understanding the sentiment. "We are who we are by the choices we make, not by the circumstances imposed on us," she reflected. "And I choose to be here with you, building something true on foundations that no longer hide secrets." Alexander looked at her with a mixture of admiration and infinite gratitude. "You've transformed not only my life, Emily, but my understanding of what truly matters. Before I measured my success in square feet built and contracts signed. Now I measure it in moments of shared truth. Under the mantle of that autumn night, they sealed their victory, not only legal but personal, with a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promises and futures to build. The battle had been hard, but the reward transcended any victory in the courts. The freedom to love each other without secrets, without contracts, with no obligation other than that which is born from the heart. What they couldn't foresee was that destiny, that unpredictable architect, still held one more surprise to crown their story of redemption. October unfolded its palette of reds and golds over New York, transforming Central Park into an impressionist canvas that invited contemplative long walks. For Emily and Alexander, autumn represented a time of renewal, not only personal, but also professional. The mansion, which months ago had seemed to Emily a golden cage, was gradually transforming under her influence. The cold marble and stucco rooms now filled with elements from her Virginia town, handcrafted linen curtains, Appalachian crafts, and aromatic plants that perfumed every corner with essences of rosemary and thyme. "You're creating a true American home," Alexander commented one afternoon, while watching her hang a traditional tapestry in what had been an austere corridor. "One in which one wishes to live, not just exist." Emily smiled, aware of the depth of the compliment. For a man who had inhabited spaces designed to impress more than to welcome, recognizing the difference was a significant step. "A home is built with the same rules as a good building," she responded. "Solid foundations, spaces that breathe, and details that tell stories." In the professional realm, the transformation was equally profound. After the scandal and subsequent vindication, Alexander had made decisions that surprised the business world. He restructured his company, making it more transparent, and publicly announced his commitment to allocate 30% of profits to social housing projects. What he had previously kept secret now became the distinctive mark of Morgan Construction. And to the surprise of many, this new business philosophy didn't drive investors away, but attracted a new generation committed to social responsibility. One morning in mid-October, during breakfast on the terrace, Emily presented Alexander with a proposal she had been silently working on for weeks. "I want to create a foundation," she announced, extending a folder full of carefully prepared documents. "One that offers microcredit to families like mine in Virginia and the interior states breaking cycles of predatory indebtedness." Alexander examined the papers with genuine interest, impressed by the meticulousness of the project. "You've thought of everything," he commented, turning pages detailing organizational structures, funding sources, and selection criteria. "This could transform entire communities." "I learned from the best," Emily responded with a complicit smile. "Observing you work these months, I understood that great transformations begin with clear visions and detailed plans." Alexander looked at her with a mixture of pride and admiration that made her heart race even after months together. "You don't need my approval, Emily," he said finally. "But if you'll allow me, I'd love to be part of this project." "I don't want you to be part of it," she responded, surprising him. I want us to be equal partners, each contributing our strengths. Your business experience and my first-hand knowledge of the real needs. The proposal symbolically sealed the transformation of their relationship, from a unilateral contract where he held all the power to an equitable partnership where each contributed unique and complementary values. On the afternoon of October 30th, as New York prepared for Halloween, they received an unexpected visit. Richard Miller, visibly aged by recent events, requested to see them. "We have nothing to talk about with him," was Alexander's first reaction, protective. Emily, however, after a moment of reflection, made a surprising decision. "We should receive him," she said calmly. "Cycles of revenge only end when someone decides to break them." In the main hall, under Dorothy's watchful eye, who made no effort to disguise her distrust, Richard Miller seemed a shadow of the arrogant man who had tried to destroy them. His slumped shoulders and evasive gaze spoke of a defeat that transcended the courts. "I've come to ask for forgiveness," he began, with a barely audible voice. "I know I have no right to expect your acceptance, but I needed to say it personally." The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut. Emily observed Alexander, whose face reflected an internal struggle between decades of resentment and the possibility of liberation that forgiveness offers. "Why now?" Alexander finally asked. "What has changed?" Richard looked up, and for the first time Emily saw something authentic in his eyes. Remorse. "I'm dying," he confessed. "Terminal cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less, and I've understood too late that I've wasted decades feeding a hatred that has only poisoned myself." The revelation transformed the atmosphere. Death, that great leveler, had the power to recontextualize even the most entrenched conflicts. "What you did to Mercedes is unforgivable," Alexander said firmly. "The harassment, the persecution that led her to flee and die far from her son." Richard nodded, accepting the accusation without defending himself. "I don't seek to absolve my guilt," he responded, "just to break the chain before I depart. I've prepared legal documents that completely restore your reputation, admit my responsibility for all false accusations, and establish a compensation fund for families affected by my actions." He extended an envelope that neither immediately moved to take. Finally, Emily accepted it, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as recognition of the effort to repair the damage caused. "Forgiveness isn't something we can grant today," she said with gentleness but firmness. "It's a path, not a destination, but we accept your attempt at reparation as a first step." When Richard left, taking with him the weight of a life dedicated to revenge, Emily and Alexander remained silent, processing the impact of that encounter. "I never imagined I could feel compassion for him," Alexander finally confessed. "But seeing him like that, so diminished, so aware of the emptiness of his existence." Emily intertwined her fingers with his, offering the anchor of her presence. "Sometimes true victory isn't in seeing your adversary fall, but in not becoming what you fight," she reflected. "You chose to build, not destroy. That's why we're here, reconstructing not just buildings but lives." That night, as the city prepared to honor its dead, they celebrated the life they had chosen to create together, a life built on foundations of truth and mutual respect, more solid than any skyscraper Alexander had built. What neither imagined was that life, in its unpredictable generosity, still held a final gift to crown their story of redemption and love. November advanced with its grey mantle over New York, but inside the Morgan mansion, now transformed into a true home, an anticipated spring was blooming. The news came on a morning of gentle rain, when Emily, after weeks of subtle changes in her body, confirmed what she already suspected. She was expecting a child. The way she communicated it to Alexander was as special as it was unexpected. During a visit to one of the social housing projects on the outskirts of New York, while touring a model apartment, Emily led him to the smallest room. "What do you think of this space?" she asked with feigned casualness, while her eyes shone with a barely contained secret. "It's a perfect room for an office or perhaps a small—" Alexander stopped mid-sentence, catching something in Emily's expression that made his heart race. "Emily?" She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat abdomen. "I was thinking more of a nursery," she said softly, "for about 7 months from now, approximately." Alexander's face transformed with a mixture of astonishment, disbelief, and a joy so intense it seemed to illuminate every corner of his being. At 45, He had built buildings that defined the skyline of several cities, but the prospect of building a family left him speechless. We're, he stammered, unable to complete the question. Emily nodded with tears of happiness shining in her eyes. We're going to be parents. In that moment, in that humble room of a project destined for working families, far from the luxury of their mansion, they merged in an embrace that contained all the promises of the future. A future that not even the most optimistic of the two would have imagined when they signed that marriage contract barely a year ago. The news of the pregnancy transformed not only their personal lives, but also the direction of their joint projects. The Microcredit Foundation, which they had baptized Bridges in honor of the connection between their families, incorporated a new program specifically designed for young entrepreneurial mothers. At the end of November, when the first ultrasound confirmed the pregnancy was progressing perfectly, they made a decision that surprised their closest circle. Anthony, whose health had notably improved in recent months, would permanently move in with them. This child deserves to grow up knowing his grandfather, Emily explained as they adapted a suite on the ground floor for the carpenter. And you deserve to enjoy every moment. Anthony, with tears in his eyes, thanked the gesture with the simplicity that characterized him. I always dreamed of teaching my grandchildren the craft of wood, he said, caressing the tools Alexander had brought from his old workshop. Now I'll be able to fulfill that dream. December brought with it renewed hope. Alexander's company had not only survived the scandal, but emerged strengthened under a new corporate philosophy that integrated social responsibility with commercial success. Emily, meanwhile, flourished in her new role as co-director of the foundation, bringing a fresh and authentic perspective that deeply connected with the communities they sought to help. Christmas Eve at the Morgan Mansion was an intimate but significant celebration. For the first time, there was no ostentation or pretense, just the warmth of a family gathered around a table where Virginia traditions mixed with New York dishes, honoring the shared roots they had discovered throughout their extraordinary journey together. During dinner, Anthony raised his glass for a toast that moved all present. To Mercedes and Isabella, he said, with an emotion-laden voice, whose midsummer night dream has finally been fulfilled. Their children not only met, but now perpetuate their friendship in a new life. When the church bells announced the arrival of Christmas, Emily and Alexander were on the terrace, contemplating the lights of New York under an exceptionally starry sky for a winter night. You know what amazes me most, Emily reflected, nestled against him. How something that began in the worst possible way has transformed into the best that could have happened to us. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude that time had only intensified. Perhaps because destiny isn't written in the circumstances imposed on us, but in how we choose to respond to them, he replied, gently placing a hand on the womb where their child was growing. And you, from the first day, chose to see beyond appearances. Just as you chose to respect me when you had all the power not to, she added, intertwining her fingers with his. Perhaps that's true love. Not what they make us feel, but what they inspire us to be. Under that New York sky, as the year approached its end, they sealed with a kiss the promise of a future built not on contracts or obligations, but on the most solid foundation that exists, the daily, conscious and free choice to love each other fully, with all their complexities and wonders. Spring, though still distant on the calendar, was already blooming in their hearts, anticipating the arrival not only of a new life, but of a new way of understanding what it truly means to build something lasting. The New York spring unfolded its splendor with unusual generosity that year. The cherry blossoms transformed the parks into colorful clouds that seemed suspended between the blue sky and the reborn earth. It was as if nature itself were celebrating the miracle that was about to happen. Emily, with the prominent 8-month pregnant belly, contemplated from the window of what had been her individual room, now transformed into a luminous nursery, how Alexander and Anthony worked together in the garden, installing a small wooden gazebo that the carpenter had specially designed for future family afternoons. The image of those two men, separated by almost 2 decades in age but united by a common purpose, evoked in Emily an emotion so intense that she felt tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. If someone had told her a year ago that she would find such fullness in that arrangement that had begun as a cold transaction, she would have considered it a cruel irony. The pregnancy hormones are making me too sentimental, she murmured to herself, drying her tears with a smile. "It's not just the hormones," said Dorothy's voice behind her. "It's the wisdom that comes with recognizing blessings when we have them before us." The older woman, who had become a maternal figure for Emily during the past year, approached to contemplate the scene with her. "You know, when you arrived at this house, I told Mr. Alexander that you had brought light to spaces that had been in shadows for too long," Dorothy continued. "But not even I imagined how much truth there was in those words." Emily smiled, silently thanking the constant presence and sincere affection of that woman who had witnessed the complete transformation of the Morgan mansion, from an ostentatious residence to a true home. The Bridges Foundation had become a success that exceeded all expectations. In just 6 months, they had helped more than 200 families start sustainable small businesses, breaking cycles of economic dependency and creating more resilient communities. Emily directed the project from home during the last months of pregnancy, demonstrating that her youth was no impediment to leading with vision and sensitivity. Alexander, for his part, had experienced a transformation that astonished those who had known him for decades in the business world. The hermetic and calculating man had given way to a transparent leader who integrated human values in every business decision. His story of overcoming, from construction worker to socially committed magnate, inspired a new generation of entrepreneurs. On the afternoon of May 12th, as the sun began its descent tinting the New York sky with orange tones, Emily felt the first contractions. With a calm that surprised even herself, she notified Alexander, who, contrary to her serenity, entered a state of nervousness that would have been comical in any other circumstance. "Everything is prepared, everything is controlled," he repeated, while simultaneously trying to locate the car keys, the hospital bag, and call the doctor. Emily, observing that scene with a mixture of amusement and tenderness, understood a fundamental truth. That 46-year-old man, accustomed to managing multi-million-dollar projects and teams of hundreds of people, found himself completely vulnerable before the miracle of life they were about to witness together. "Alexander," she called him softly, taking his hand to stop his frantic activity. "We are ready for this. Both of us." The delivery was long, but without complications. For 16 hours, Emily demonstrated a strength that astonished the medical team. Alexander didn't leave her side for an instant, holding her hand, drying her sweat, whispering words of encouragement that she would treasure forever. When finally, in the first hours of May 13th, the vigorous cry of a baby girl filled the hospital room, something extraordinary happened. Alexander, that man who had built his life on control and certainties, broke into unreserved tears as he held his daughter for the first time. "She's perfect," he murmured, observing with absolute wonder the tiny fingers that instinctively clung to his. Perfect like her mother. They decided to name her Isabella Mercedes, honoring the two women whose friendship had planted decades ago the seed of what today was blooming as a family. Anthony, upon meeting his granddaughter hours later, couldn't contain his tears when recognizing in her features traces of the two sisters who had defined his life. "It's as if the circle has finally completed," said the old man, gently rocking the little one, "as if all the pieces have found their place." 3 weeks later, in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden, they baptized Isabella Mercedes under a gazebo adorned with orange blossoms. It wasn't an ostentatious celebration, as would have corresponded to the daughter of the real estate magnate, but a simple yet deeply meaningful reunion where each detail honored the Virginia and Chicago roots that converged in that new life. That night, while the little one slept peacefully in her artisanal cradle, personally carved by Anthony with American oak, Emily and Alexander contemplated the stars from the terrace in a moment of quiet intimacy after weeks of adaptation to their new reality as parents. "Do you remember when you gave me that key on the first day?" Emily asked, leaning against Alexander's chest. "You said I would decide when and if I wanted to open the door between our chambers." Alexander nodded, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I never imagined that simple key would open so many different doors," she continued. "To your past, to my true origin, to a future that neither of us could have conceived. Life is full of doors," he reflected. "But they're useless if we don't have the courage to turn the key and face what's on the other side." Emily smiled, recognizing the depth of that observation. "And sometimes," she added, The most intimidating doors lead to the most beautiful spaces. In the silence that followed, contemplating the nocturnal New York that stretched before them like a mantle of blinking lights, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey that had begun with a cold and calculated contract, and that now culminated in the deepest and most authentic bond two human beings can share. In the adjoining room, Isabella Mercedes slept peacefully, oblivious to the fact that her mere existence represented the culmination of interrupted stories, of lost friendships, of dreams whispered by a midsummer night's fire decades ago. In her small veins flowed the blood of two lineages that destiny in its infinite wisdom had decided to intertwine through a path as improbable as it was perfect. "True love," Emily murmured, looking toward the window where her daughter's cradle was visible, "isn't what they make us feel, but what we transform into when we choose it each day, in each decision, in each shared moment." Alexander gently kissed her forehead, feeling a gratitude so profound that words were insufficient to express it. "And true wealth," he responded, "isn't measured in properties or bank accounts, but in the lives we touch, the hearts we open, the souls we redeem, beginning with our own." Under that starry New York sky, while their daughter slept the trusting sleep of one who knows herself infinitely loved, Emily and Alexander sealed with a kiss the promise to continue building together, day by day, choice after choice, the most valuable home of all, that which is built not with bricks and mortar, but with respect, admiration, and a love that flourishes beyond any contract, any obligation, any difference. What had begun as a cold transaction had transformed into the most beautiful story that neither could have imagined writing, a love story as powerful as the New England sun and as enduring as the centuries-old oaks of Virginia.